Good afternoon and welcome to this Federalist Society event. I'm Bryan Tramont with Wilkinson Barker. On behalf of the Federalist Society, I am pleased to welcome you to our program today, the Communications and Technology Policy for the Next Administration. Universal access to broadband, net neutrality, the challenges presented by the convergence of telecommunications, media, and data privacy and security, media content and ownership regulation are each topics of conversation in classrooms, courtrooms, and indeed living rooms around the country. These issues take on even more resonance as tech and innovation are seen as potential policy solutions to some of our most vexing challenges, both in energy and education, healthcare, and immigration. Moreover, the debate around these issues is taking place against a backdrop of unprecedented competition, investment, and innovation in the sector. So it comes as no surprise that these issues have emerged as an integral part of the 2008 presidential campaign. Now that the choice of presidential candidates has finally become clear, it is time to begin comparing and evaluating the candidates' positions on these issues. To that end, we have invited two distinguished former chairmen of the FCC, the Honorable Reed Hundt and the Honorable Michael Powell, to discuss the presidential candidate's vision for communications and telecommunications in the next administration. Chairman Hundt represents Senator Barack Obama's campaign and advises the Democratic nominee on communications and technology policy. He chaired the FCC under President Clinton from 1993 to 1997. Chairman Powell represents Senator McCain's campaign and advises the Republican nominee on communications and technology policy issues. Mr. Powell was appointed by the FCC in 1997 by President Clinton and elevated to chairman by President Bush in 2001, ultimately serving until 2005. I'm not going to do a detailed review of each of the chairman's current activities, but they each serve on a number of prestigious boards, are actively engaged in technology, business, and investment opportunities, give time to a number of public interest and philanthropic organizations, and speak around the world on technology and innovation policy. So we are extremely fortunate to have them with us today, these articulate spokesmen of the respective campaigns. Our format today will be fairly straightforward. Each speaker will be giving a brief opening statement, providing an overview of each campaign's perspective on these issues. I will then ask a series of questions for each chairman. Finally, time permitting, we will open it up for questions from the audience. So with that, I'll turn it over to Chairman Hundt.
Hello, everybody. It's good to see a lot of friends again. It's particularly nice to see Commissioner Adelstein here, the only guy in the room with something powerful to do every day. And I want to also acknowledge my son Nathaniel, who was sitting right there, but now is sitting right here. And so it's pretty embarrassing to have to talk in front of your children when there's other people watching you. But I'm very honored that he's here. And as you may or may not know, he's been a Obama field organizer since he graduated college a year ago and won 3 of the 4 states in which he was organizing. I want to thank you very much for inviting me, Byron. I want to assure you that I and Barack Obama and Felix Frankfurter believe in our federalism, but don't put me on any of your mailing lists.
Maybe too late, actually.
And of course, Michael here. Michael is a very good friend. We agree on a lot of things. We agreed on everything when he was in the Clinton administration. But we've decided that we're going to identify all the points of disagreement today, both because we think this is an important election and a very important choice, and also because it wouldn't really be fun for you if we didn't. I do want to comment that this is, I think, a typical Washington event. It's 100 degrees outside, so you all have decided to have a couple of formers blow hot air on you just to add to it. I'm very grateful to all of you for coming, but I want to set this tone. I think that this is a critically important election. I'm not alone in that view. I think the American people believe that very, very deeply, and that is why the turnout has been so spectacular in the caucuses and in the primaries, and the interest level all across the country in this election is higher than in any election that I've ever witnessed, and I am old, so I am speaking from experience. And it's experience that makes me want to say a few things about Barack Obama and John McCain in these opening remarks. I have known each of them longer than they have known each other. I've advised and chatted with and worked with and discussed policy with Senator Obama for more than 5 years, and with Senator McCain for 11 years. Based on my knowledge of the thinking and the values of each of them, in respect of the technology sectors of America, I believe that you should vote for Barack Obama to be the president. And I don't think it's even a close question. If we can't lead the world in both energy and information technology, we can't lead in anything. Energy and information are the two essential inputs to all other sectors. Energy and information are essential services to everyone, both in their social and business lives. We need everyone to be able to pay as little as practical to get as much as needed of both of these services if we want to give the next generation a higher standard of living than the past generation. And in my experience, Senator McCain does not pursue the goals of technologically driven growth. In fact, he doesn't even agree that that should be a high goal of government. And in my experience, Barack Obama understands and cares about how to use government nimbly, smartly, and minimally to enable technological entrepreneurship to drive economic and social development. John McCain, as president, in my view, by reason of bad ideas and in some cases no ideas, would turn the past into a high watermark of America. And Barack Obama, by choice of goals and tactics, by serene style and thoughtful purpose, would assure that the American dream would live on for generations to come. I want to give you 3 examples of how John McCain has shown repeatedly that he would continue to take the country down the wrong road already traveled by George Bush and his appointees. First, John McCain has consistently voted against using taxing, spending, or regulatory power to promote solar, wind, and biotech. Now, I have to grant that his policy staff told the Sierra Club that he did support tax credits for alternative energy, although he's voted against them. But then in Richmond, just yesterday, he agreed with a donor who asked if his policy was, quote, nuclear and drill wherever we've got oil. Taking him at his record and at his own words, if we have one more term of the Bush-McCain era, we will fall permanently behind the rest of the world in the pursuit of solar, wind, and other non-carbon energy sources. Second, everyone here knows that for businesses and citizens to compete in the new global information markets, we need all to be connected to each other and to the world with cheap and very high-speed internet access. But in terms of broadband access, under the Bush presidency and the McCain Commerce Committee, the United States has fallen from 4th in the world to 15th. Others have passed us because they copied the policies of Congress and the FCC from the 1990s. And Bush-McCain let them pass us even more quickly, because under their White House and their Commerce Committee, the United States altered regulations so as to undercut the direct mandates for competition enshrined in the bipartisan 1996 Telecom Act. What John McCain could not do by voting against that law, he accomplished by getting the FCC to repeal it by reinterpretation. Then to seal the deal, Bush, McCain, and the FCC encouraged and approved the reintegration of Ma Bell into 2 huge new Bell companies. John McCain even voted against the E-rate, the government program to put the internet into every classroom so that we would lead the world in having all school children go online, whether those children are rich or poor or middle class. Third, John McCain has supported media consolidation while opposing network neutrality. The Bush-McCain vision of the media is that Americans should not get access to whatever they choose over the internet, but they should have their traditional outlets be brought under bigger local regional monopolies. But what convinces me that John McCain shouldn't be our president is not just his policies and practices. It is that in my experience with him over 11 years, there is a yawning gap between what he says and what he does. I will settle for just one example, earmarks. I remember when I was the FCC chair, he called me to tell me he wouldn't pressure me to do what I thought was the wrong thing. But in fact, he has again and again successfully pressured the FCC to do special deals for individual companies. While John McCain inveighs against spending earmarks, he has handed out more regulatory pork than Rockland's has delivered barbecue. Examples include FCC approvals of deals involving Paxson, Glencairn, and Gannett. I don't want to neglect mentioning telephone company immunity and surveillance. John McCain wants to immunize the telephone companies from liability for illegal spying on Americans. I think that he has said he wants them to apologize as long as they don't explain what they are apologizing for. Beyond that, it appears that as president he would feel free to use the telephone companies to do that spying, whether Congress has declared it unlawful or not. I am hopeful that Mike Powell can clarify John's position on this critical topic, but more than that, I'd like it to be justified. Now, as to Barack Obama, when it comes to technology, he gets it. He understands the importance of green energy and would spend at least $150 billion in the next decade on alternative fuels. He wants to use tax credits to bring in the private sector entrepreneurship necessary to make green energy competitive with carbon energy. He would require that the United States go from 1% of electricity coming from green tech to 25% within 17 years. He would not abandon either coal or nuclear power, but he has specific and well thought through proposals for how to use these problematic fuel sources. Barack would shift USF support from subsidizing voice to deploying broadband and having voice run as VoIP over the top. For Senator Obama, 31% penetration of broadband in rural areas and 49% in suburban areas is completely unacceptable. Barack Obama is an original co-sponsor of network neutrality legislation. He believes broadcasters do owe a public interest duty to viewers. He does not support further media consolidation before localism and diversity are promoted by new policies. On all the key technology issues, John McCain and Barack Obama clearly disagree. But even more important, Barack Obama, in my judgment, has the deliberative style coupled with passionate conviction that would not only make him a good president, but a great one. He is smart as all get out, but I have never met anyone in politics who listens better, learns more quickly, and decides more resolutely. This is my 6th presidential campaign, and the first one where I've supported someone with whom I didn't go to high school or law school. That's what I call passing the torch to a new generation. But let me tell you this, folks. Barack Obama is someone very, very special, and we just don't want to miss the chance to have him lead us. Thank you.
Thank you, Reed, for that blindly partisan speech. Reed says he liked me better during the Clinton administration when I agreed. I liked him better when he became a businessman and rediscovered capitalism and its benefits. But he is a good friend, and it's good to share the stage with him. I also think it's notable that in the entire series of remarks, about 20 minutes was spent on telling you what's negative about John McCain, and less than 4 was spent on the positive policies of Barack Obama. So let me rectify the first and say only a little about the second. John McCain went to the Commerce Committee in 1986. More than anyone else in the United States serving in government, he oversaw the most fundamental information technological revolution in the history of mankind. He watched the arrival of the cell phone redistribute power and services to consumers. He watched the rise of deregulation in telecom markets as implemented in the 96 Act. He observed the commercialization of the Internet in 1994 and has had a front row seat in the revolution, observing and acting on through his experiences what was working and what was not. He comes to his views principally as you look at technology and innovation with an understanding of contrasting the 750,000-word Telecommunication Act in 1996 and the benefits it's produced for consumers against the vibrancy, the innovation, the creativity, the speed of change that are associated with the Internet and the information age. We don't believe that that's a coincidence. When government, in one sense, is the master chef of what is competition and what are services, and when government allows private sector and entrepreneurs to deliver to Americans products of higher and better use. What is the role of government? Let me say something about his views on that. I think Senator McCain has come to the conclusion, as all Americans should, that the information age is the greatest epic of our lifetime. It is as fundamental and as powerful as the agricultural age and the industrial ages that preceded it. We are in a period in which we are setting the stage for not ourselves, who are all frauds and adapting to the changes that we're witnessing, but for our children. Our children who've never put their finger in the dial of a rotary phone. My children who've never known a television set without 150 to 200 channels, who have never seen a television program sign off at midnight with the American flag and the Star-Spangled Banner playing. My children who have never known a television set without a remote control or life without an Xbox. They're really the true digital generation, and the ambitions and the innovation and the optimism we see the information age should be drawn from that sense of obligation. We're making the world ready for them. What he's come to conclude is that the most important thing government can do is try to understand the magic of the conditions in the environment that produce innovation, creativity, and change. We talk a lot with envy about the developments in China and India and Asia and the world, but I go to those countries as well, and I'll tell you the first thing I'm asked: how do you do it? Why does America invent everything? Why do we create? Why do we innovate? Why do we inspire? Why do we discover the undiscovered? Why does Google rise here and not there? Why does Facebook create there? Why does Silicon Valley? Why do other parts of America have this magic formula that seems to constantly be on the front edge of creation? I think the best policy is the one that attempts to understand what those conditions are and create an environment in which entrepreneurs are allowed to do what they do well. We believe that there are a number of key components that are quite obvious and enduring. The first is you have to have access to risk capital. We can talk all day long about what we want to see. Someone must pay for it. Someone must take the risks associated with investing and making that a possibility. The availability of risk capital in America is one of the most distinguishing features of why innovation and creation get here. Now, it may be very populist and fun to talk about soaking the rich. And it may be very convenient to say that somehow that's an evil in America. But I'll tell you this, I don't know many people who hate rich. I know many people who want to get rich. I mean, one of the great motivations of innovation and entrepreneurship is the opportunity to pursue at great personal risk to yourself, the opportunity to make a life better for your family and for your by virtue of your investments in a single generation. That's not done by increasing capital gains taxes, right? If I'm going to take the risk and I'm going to take the investment, which is the theory behind capital gains taxation, I should enjoy the fruits of my labor. And if I want to incentivize entrepreneurship in America, I should do so by letting that entrepreneur keep as much of the fruits of the labor as possible. Senator Obama would raise that dramatically. Secondly, corporate taxation. Oh, let's just tax the big corporations. Let me tell you what happens. A recent study by the Congressional Budget Office found that 70% of the impact of higher corporate taxation falls on labor. Why? Because the owner of capital is free to move the capital offshore. Major companies in the United States have substantial amounts of their cash holdings held overseas, to the benefit of the labor of those populations. Why? Because the United States has the highest corporate tax rate in the world. In the world. I don't think that's a giveaway. That's a competitive disadvantage for America. That is massive sources of capital that can be put to work in the domestic shores of the United States. Innovation, jobs, labor forces. So corporate taxation is not some simple windfall to oil companies or some favored, disfavored corporate entity. It is the critical component of whether capital stays in our country to be put to work and to hire workers, or whether it's put to the benefit of Ireland or France or UK or Asia or India, and by the way, all countries of which have lower corporate taxes than we do. Second thing you need, a skilled workforce. Two major components of this that seem clear. You have to be providing the skilled labor necessary to operate in the information economy. The first component of that is the education system. This year or recently, we only graduated about 20% of Bachelor of Arts degree graduates graduated with math and science. That's a call to arms. Failure to improve that number will be failure for us to provide for those children in the generation that needs to be able to compete effectively in that generation. We have to do a lot to improve education. Last year, we went from 16,000 computer science majors down to 8,000. That needs to turn around, and we need policies that invigorate our educational system. But it's also a reason why Senator McCain has been a supporter of comprehensive immigration reform. It's great to talk about the education system, a critical call to arms, needs for immediate as well as long-term solutions, but it doesn't change the fact that as we're sitting here today, high-tech companies across the United States are suffering for the lack of talented, high-tech skilled workers. The H-1B visa system is a disaster. The cap on that, preventing companies from being able to hire the skilled labor necessary to keep our economy running, are being damaged by an artificially low cap that needs to be able to be adjusted more nimbly for changing market conditions. And he's been a strong supporter of reforming the H-1B visa system as well as part of comprehensive immigration reform. The third condition of innovation that we believe strongly in is light regulation and free and open markets. As I said before, one who has spent any time in the last decade around the telecosm has got to understand that the brilliant 1996 Telecom Act that Reed says was such a great blessing that Senator McCain opposed has produced more for lawyers and lobbyists, something supposedly we also don't support, than it has for the market of the economy. We need to continue to be committed to the understanding that the information age moves quickly. Its vibrancy depends on its speed of change. I have seen very few regulatory systems overbearing do anything but retard that development. So Senator McCain believes in innovative fast markets and believes that government does have a role. There is anti-competitive behavior. There are things that should be stopped. But that should be done in a forceful enforcement model of antitrust enforcement when people cheat, where you have actual evidence of demonstrable harm by carriers rather than trying to regulate their predispositions, their temptations, their predilections. Senator Obama's policy paper talks about net neutrality being needed as legislation because carriers will be tempted to do bad things. Well, I say leave the regulation of our temptations to preachers and pulpits and religion. Free trade, not mentioned. There's a good reason. George Bush didn't invent free trade, neither did Senator McCain. The commitment to free trade has grown over decades of understanding of what the consequences are when a country tries to isolate itself from global markets. I don't begin to understand how people can talk glowingly about the information age or the severe global challenges of energy and climate change, but then believe somehow we can retract and not interact in a competitive and even playing field with our trading partners. Senator McCain is an unflinching believer in free trade. And whether it be Smoot-Hawley or anything that's preceded it, we have been taught this lesson over and over and over again, that any time the United States attempts to limit the possibilities and the hope that free trade provides, it is our citizens that do the suffering. Tom Friedman was right. The world is flat. And better to embrace that and be building an economy that can compete than to thinking you can hide back behind the walls of protectionism. Free trade agreements lay stagnant, whether with Colombia or South Korea, one of the most significant tech innovators in the world, but yet we can't seem to find a way as a nation to interact with them more fully. Finally, you need a commitment to discovery, right? There's so much more out there to be known than is known, and government does have a role. I agree with Reed. 2.7% of GDP on research and development is unacceptable. The nation has to have a commitment to new discovery, to research, development, to science, and it has to spend much more to do that. It's one of the reasons Senator McCain has taken the position of making permanent the research and development tax credit in support of continued R&D. There's a lot more, but if we keep going, there won't be any point to questions. So just let me conclude by saying there is going to be a stark choice. But I have to vehemently disagree, and I hope that you do after I finish, that McCain is without ideas or policies or a coherent worldview about technology. And more importantly, his is born from having observed and watched both the benefits of things well taken and the mistakes that the country have made. There's a reason why you can spend more time on John McCain's record than Senator Obama's. He has one. And he's committed to instilling it in a way that the information innovation economy continues to produce a great empire in the 21st century. Thank you.
I'm glad we're off to a rigorous start.
We don't really need you.
Well, it's funny, that chairman used to say that all the time, but yet somehow I kept coming back. Gentlemen, why don't we begin with net neutrality? Talk a little bit about how each candidate views the net neutrality debate, what impact it would have on investment and the consumer experience going forward.
The first thing I would say is that Senator McCain has always embraced, as I hope you gathered from my remarks, the importance of having a free and open internet. He fully subscribes to what is commonly known as the four freedoms and the importance of making sure consumers have end-to-end access to the services that are important. On this, I think we all agree. He does not currently support network neutrality legislation. The reasons are quite simple. If any of you have attended some of the net neutrality hearings that have taken place under the auspices of the FCC, you will watch a table of highly talented PhDs in network architecture battling over what practices constitute reasonable management and what practices constitute discrimination of bits. We're not confident that that architectural question is ripe to be resolved by the United States Congress. I think that the secondary consequences of empowering legislation around difficult and technical architectural questions, when it's far from clear what problem you're trying to solve, I think is dangerous. The senator believes is dangerous. And so he approaches legislation or the need for it quite skeptically. That's combined with his belief that a better approach in a new and vibrant market is to put greater emphasis on an enforcement model and an antitrust model. Not that we're not concerned about anti-competitive behavior, but why not take it on when you have a factual record, demonstrable evidence of harm that you can wrestle with and resolve the delicate balance between what's reasonable network practice and what's discrimination. I can't begin to imagine, and I have some experience in this area, how you would actually draft this piece of legislation without having particularly problematic consequences. And I will say this, I say it as much as a belief of the senators as a warning to the community. I think you need to recognize that net neutrality legislation would be the first fateful step of inviting the federal government regulating the nature of the internet. And while it may seem to come with a positive and well-intended perspective, you will now have authorized the United States government to make difficult questions and judgments about its architecture, the nature of the service, the nature of prohibited and acceptable conduct, and that's something we think is not yet ripe for United States Congress intervention.
Net neutrality is basically the broadband, future-oriented, modern version of common carrier, and common carrier worked in this country to provide a absolute rule against discrimination, and it worked for decades and decades and decades. And only those who are not willing to embrace the future are reluctant to take that same principle and apply it to broadband. Net neutrality is a principle of free speech, free choice, and sound economics. The core idea is that access network owners should not be able to discriminate against individuals in either the individual search for or dissemination of content. That's the core idea. A great example of what happens when there is no net neutrality law or regulation occurred last fall when a women's rights organization tried to send text messages over the Verizon network and was told by Verizon that they couldn't do it. Now, in my view, you don't need any more evidence that it is unfair, inappropriate, and inconsistent with American values for the government and the FCC to delegate the power to censorship, which they could not hold themselves under the First Amendment, but to grant that power of censorship to a network access provider. That is why this is an important issue. In terms of the economics of net neutrality, there are myriad studies that demonstrate that the more people want to send, the more money the network access providers are going to be able to charge, and the more they're going to be able to invest in the network. So there is no objection here to net neutrality based on economics, and it is the case that Michael is exactly right. Also, we need to have sound antitrust policies. But here's the question I would put to my friend. Can you name one merger since 1986 that John McCain has opposed?
Well, you could say the same thing about your commission, Reed, or every Democratic commissioner did at the FCC. In fact, I think I was the first commissioner, chairman of the Republican administration to block a major merger in 30 years at the FCC.
Well, I didn't ask about you.
Well,
you blocked the MCI Sprint merger. I asked about John McCain.
John McCain, first of all, I'm going to go back to your net neutrality question. You said a lot there. You heard the differences. Common carrier regulation is the key to the future of the Internet. I think on that we just fundamentally disagree. We don't think common carriage has produced a model for great innovation. I also think that if we're going to have challenging questions, I think we could probably count on one hand the number of incidents that we probably would plausibly call violations of network neutrality principle. And you have to ask yourself the question, what is the fundamental threshold of an all-encompassing ex-ante form of regulation versus enforcement? We happen to be of the view that the case should be more compelling than a handful of even well-publicized incidents. But again, you can make your judgment about that. I think it's unfair to say that the senator somehow doesn't care about antitrust or enforcement. He has always believed that that is a level of expertise properly invested in the executive branch. Congress doesn't implement and enforce the antitrust laws. The United States Department of Justice does, the Federal Trade Commission does, and the FCC does. I believe if he were sitting here, he was saying our obligation as the Congress is to confirm nominees of the president who are skilled and capable in doing that, and allow them to do that job effectively. No member of Congress makes decisions on antitrust matters. That's an executive branch function. Similarly, you won't see a huge record of him out there glowing and supporting tons of mergers either. I think that's because it's consistent with his view that the nature of that function is best done by the executive branch, not by the United States Congress. Now, similarly, what does Congress do? It holds hearings and it investigates. Take media ownership alone. Senator McCain, during the Commerce Committee, held over 7 hearings on the issue of consolidation in the media industry. He was hardly moribund in looking at the issue. But at the end of the day, unless somebody wants to change the legislative framework, those are judgments that were going to be rendered by the Federal Communication Commission.
John, may I?
Is it on point, or are we going in a different direction?
I think it's microscopically on point.
Microscopically on point. Well, then.
John McCain wrote a letter to the chairman of the FCC urging that the FCC lower its standards of review for the merger of SBC Ameritech. John McCain twice introduced legislation to permit larger scale media mergers. John McCain supported you, Mike, on a 3-2 vote in June of 2003 to expand media ownership. 3 million Americans protested that particular policy. Senators Dorgan and Lott introduced a resolution to reverse the FCC vote. It passed 55-40. McCain voted against it. I could go on.
Well, why don't we go on, actually, and discuss about, turn to that issue, because that is obviously an issue that has plagued all commissions since the 96 Act was passed, which is the media ownership limits, have faced a difficult time in court, obviously, as you've referenced, a difficult time on Capitol Hill and in public opinion. What is the proper role of media ownership limits from an Obama campaign perspective?
He doesn't think there should be any more media consolidation until new policies are developed to promote diversity and localism.
And once those policies are in place, then they would be reassessed?
When you put those policies in place, then you're permitted to build on top of it a clear and understandable antitrust paradigm that could be followed by everybody in industry. What we have and have had for the last 7.5 straight years is the following: no antitrust policy and approval of everything.
I wish facts still mattered. 7 years of the approval of everything. I think DirecTV and EchoStar would think differently.
I'm sorry, I was speaking about John McCain. Again, I say the following, excuse me for interrupting. Name one merger since 1986 he opposed.
Well, I'm not going to attempt to do that. I think that
Okay.
I think it's a cheeky argument, but
We were talking about facts.
So,
But I agree that it was cheeky.
well, you're a very cheeky guy.
now that we have the cheeky stipulation in place, I'm confident we can move forward from here. Chairman Powell, on media ownership issues, generally.
I think the first thing that Senator McCain believes and has a record of is that with regard to the component of ownership that it's about diversity, one of the things we need to spend a lot more attention on is creating more opportunities for diversity, just as much as the negative implication of trying to retard or restrict companies that are already in the market. He was an enormous supporter of low-power FM radio, for example, as a way of providing more opportunity and more entry opportunities for more folks. He also was one of the most vocal supporters, unable to rally support even among Democrats, for a reformed tax certificate policy to allow minorities to own more stations. He has tended to try to address those issues by creating more opportunities for entrants. So I think that's one thing that he thinks very hard about media ownership. I think the second thing is he believes that, and maybe we would agree with this, it's broken in the sense that are we really regulating media through the eyes and the ears of our children? Is it really sensible that when my child changes the channel from 7 to 107, the First Amendment changes? Is it really sensible that we somehow don't count in the market definition even cable television when setting broadcast ownership limits as if it somehow just doesn't even exist? But yet, I think I read recently, it's now in the 90 percentile of Americans who subscribe to television, but regulators want to willfully disregard other components of the marketplace in an effort to draw the lines. I think that without reaching a specific conclusion of where those limits should be, Senator McCain feels passionately that we have led ourselves to a relatively irrational and incoherent regulatory regime. One in which it depends on where you stand, what services you're using. You know, we hear a lot of talk about a bit is a bit, but that is not what our media policies say or do. We hear a lot about the enormous potential of the internet and video distribution, video streaming, and new ventures like Hulu. And we read every third day about the demise of the New York Times and the Chicago Tribune. But somehow, when you turn to the question of what the right structure is for an entire media industry, we put these things in small little buckets and evaluate them individually. And I think he thinks that's a mistake. So just like I think for Reid a prerequisite would be new public interest obligations, I think for Senator McCain, his prerequisite would be a much more coherent, rational platform in which to reach the question in which you attempted to harmonize regulations across the space, as opposed to have rules that are about a broadcaster or about a cable industry or about an internet industry.
Chairman Powell touched on some diversity issues about low-power TV and tax certificate issues. What are some of Senator Obama's views on how to increase diversity? And you touched on localism as well. Maybe cover both of those, Chairman Hundt.
Diversity. John McCain was right when he introduced a bill to use tax credits to promote diversity in ownership. That was blocked by Newt Gingrich in 1995. 1995 was 13 years ago. John McCain became the chairman of the Senate Commerce Committee in 1997. He served as that role until 2001. 2 years he wasn't the chairman, then he was again for 2 years. And while he was the chairman of that committee, he did not reintroduce and move that bill. What changed? All that changed is that it became harder and harder and harder to get diversity in this sector, and yet John was not there to stand up for the views that he had advocated. And here's the other thing that happened in that time period. He stopped urging tax credits for any purpose that I'm aware of, and in particular, tax credits for solar and biotech and wind are absolutely essential to attract the capital necessary to overcome initial entry costs for entrepreneurs. But John is not there to offer those tax credits.
Well, I would have to check on the specifics of legislation, but it's simply inaccurate to say that much attention wasn't paid to tax certificates. When I was chairman, I specifically drafted, in cooperation with Senator McCain, a new tax certificate policy, which he championed. I would have to go look at what the specifics of what the legislation did or didn't do, but we spent a lot of time on that effort, frankly, and I was personally involved in it and personally working with him. He was the one senator, by the way, I marched the halls of the Commerce Committee, Democrats and Republicans alike, and he's the one who agreed to take up the mission. I did not get similar agreement from senators, including Democratic senators on that committee, for the effort. So I was certainly there less than 7 years ago.
Let's move on to broadband technologies. Chairman Hundt referenced the drop in America's ranking in broadband deployment throughout the world. Can we talk a little bit more about your vision of how we would, on that metric, catch up, what the right policies are, where we've perhaps gone awry?
Broadband. First, we need a government that will stop redefining broadband down so as to pull the wool over American eyes about how far behind we have fallen as against other countries. Second, we need to reform universal service so as to encourage rapid broadband where density, lack of density, and distance raise the cost per subscriber. Third, we absolutely need to be using the lowest cost technologies for broadband, and those are wireless broadband technologies. Now, John McCain, I fear, believes that the slow and slower rollout of broadband is just the market at work. And let me just give you 2 examples of why this is a terribly wrong perception. First, one way for Americans to cope with peak oil prices is to reduce business travel both by air and by commuter trips. And it has been estimated that just cheap video conferencing over high-speed broadband would reduce energy consumption by as much as 5%. If Bush-McCain had pushed for rapid broadband rollout, then right now small businesses and suburban and rural Americans could use information networks instead of roads and airports, cities on smart grids that use information technology to save energy. They want to build on top of broadband. That is an idea that you will find in Barack Obama's position papers that are on the web. In fact, you will find all the ideas that I've mentioned in Barack Obama's position papers, and you won't see a word about it on John McCain's website.
Broadband, Chairman Powell?
Sure. I think, as I said, I think broadband is the critical underpinning of an information age future, and that we should sort of be righteously indignant about where we currently stand. I think it starts with having a vision. I think that presidents don't dig holes and lay fiber, but they set goals and ambitions, and I think you have to have an ambitious, almost man-on-the-moon commitment to understanding what the role of that is in the United States. One thing that Senator McCain and I have discussed is that the biggest problem is for too long, broadband policy has been treated like utilities regulation. Somehow that it just sits there with natural gas and water and electricity without really understanding or recognizing its critical underpinnings to all problems that need to be solved in the global world. There should not be broadband policy. Broadband should be a component of the solution to healthcare policy. Broadband should be a component, and technology should be a component of the educational system. Broadband technology should be a part of the immigration challenge, part of the economic, part of dealing with displaced workers, part of making the world greener and safer for our children's future. It is once you integrate broadband technology into your vision of how you solve problems across the board that you really begin to make progress. And I think that's his commitment. I think the second thing is you have to understand the truly relentless power of technology. I don't know where else in world history you have ever seen such a powerful cost productivity curve ever, where you have exponentially increasing power in technology with exponentially decreasing costs. Technology holds, and those dynamics hold an integral part to how to bring solutions. If we were talking about cell phone broadband technology, and I 100% agree with Reed, and this is even more important, I think you would say this as well, for the world as it is for the United States. I mean, at least we have the benefits of a successful second-generation infrastructure in telecom, but for the rest of the world, this is critical. We're solving problems technologically today in wireless that we wouldn't even imagine 2 years ago. Right? When I was at the FCC, the biggest problem, oh, why do you have these different networks and all this stuff and consumers? You don't hear that much anymore. Why? Because a microprocessing chip has gotten small enough, an antenna has gotten sophisticated enough that your phone can essentially talk to 4 networks at once. And you just don't hear consumers talking about this much anymore. Why? Because technology brought a solution, brought it fast. As I watched Steve Jobs take the stage yesterday, 1 year having introduced one phone, about to introduce a second phone with GPS positioning satellite technology, not feasible 3 years ago, with third generation network capability, not feasible 3 years ago. So the other thing I think you have to do is empower technology. You have to believe that every technology platform is potentially a part of that solution. And nothing should be off the table. Broadband over power lines, the cable infrastructure, the telephone infrastructure, the wireless infrastructure, the broadcast infrastructure, all of them should be thought of as broadband. And trying to push the notion of putting data over those systems is powerful. And Reed said something about smart grids, same thing. Why isn't the grid both smart and a broadband conduit? It can and should be, and I'll bet on technology every time against the naysayers who say certain things aren't viable. Government's quite limited. I mean, we shouldn't be naive about what its ability is to do, but one thing it does is it can create demand, right? The government's probably the biggest purchaser on the planet. And I think that you have to have an administration committed in a deep way of running its processes, its business, its services to consumers in an electronically broadband compelling way. Many states who have done that have seen much greater broadband penetration. If you can't go to the DMV because you got to do it online, and if you do it online, it's quick and effective, let me tell you, you'll be ordering broadband a lot quicker. If your children's lunch schedules for tomorrow are on broadband and on the internet and the school doesn't provide it for you in another form, you're going to want broadband. We need to do more of those things to increase demand. And finally, I think you do need to have where you can, financial incentives to produce broadband. Now, government really has no open-ended checkbook. I always think this is sort of a debate that never is talked about in pragmatic, realistic terms. I do not anticipate that the United States government, in its current deficit situation, is about to have some Tennessee Valley Authority-like project and commit billions and billions of direct appropriations to the construction of broadband technology. But what I do believe with some pragmatic confidence is they can use what everybody else uses. You can use elements of the tax code to incent the behavior that you prefer. Senator McCain in Inez, Kentucky, a rural part of Kentucky, announced the idea of a People Connect program in which we would really begin to map where there is the absence of broadband, and for those who are truly needy, low-income families, rural families, we would provide subsidy and support to get them on the internet. And I think that's the kind of thing you need to do.
Do you want to weigh in?
I would just say, and this is just sticking to the facts, as far as the deficit is concerned, I remember when our guys left government, we turned over a surplus. Something has happened. And that is a reason why true conservatives, in my judgment, have never been there for John McCain and are distressed by George Bush, because the management of government's spending and taxing power has been distressing. As to these technological developments, like you, Mike, I've traveled the world a lot over the last 8 to 10 years, and this is what I see. The wireless market on a global basis is now 1.3 billion handsets. and the United States no longer has a leading company making them. All you have to do is read about Motorola's problems. If you want to see the future, if you want to see where governments and industries have worked together to have a clear rule of law that promotes investment and entrepreneurship in wireless, go to Europe, go to Asia, and avert your gaze from looking at what you see here in the United States. That's not a good fact. That's not a good fact for our children. That's not a good fact for our growth economy. It is a fixable problem. Government doesn't need to manage the technological developments, but it ought to establish a rule of law where entrepreneurs can raise money and enter these markets. We haven't seen new entry in these markets. We've seen decreasing entry and consolidation in all the communications markets. When our guys left, the cable industry and the telephone industry were roughly equally balanced in terms of market cap and were banging the heck out of each other. Today, the Bell companies are 3 to 4 times the size of the cable companies. And so what has the FCC done under John McCain's leadership and guidance with his friends running the FCC? They've said, well, cable can't grow, but there's no limit on how big the Bells can be. This is an unbalanced, even unhinged approach to creating a rule of law that promotes entrepreneurship. It's not that technology needs to be selected by government. I'm the guy that is the reason why your cell phones don't work on a common standard all around the world. But trusting the market in terms of technological development is a great thing. At the same time, you need to use a rule of law to give entrepreneurs a chance to enter and compete and produce a whole new wave of Schumpeterian competition. That's what we haven't seen under the Bush-McCain approach.
It's interesting. I've been around the FCC since Reed's tenure. Last time I checked, a number of these Bell mergers occurred during the Democratic administration. I didn't see them blocked either. So if we're going to concede that this is somehow a horrible, and it's a horrible that's laid at the feet of 2 different administrations. I was in the antitrust division of the Clinton administration that approved Bell Atlantic NYNEX. SPC Ameritech approved during a Democratic administration. So let's at least be honest, if you think that's blameworthy, where that blame lies. On the other hand, one of the things that was conceptualized during Senator McCain's tenure and the tenure of the administration was the idea of platform competition, something that had been ignored. The belief that cable could be a viable telephone competitor, the belief that cable could be a viable broadband competitor. The fact today is that cable leads the Bells in the distribution of fixed wireline broadband services. Would not have been possible without conceptualizing that vision in that way. The belief that wireless platforms can grow to be just as powerful competitors and service providers on broadband has been a key component of that policy. The empowerment and spirit that was injected into Wi-Fi, something we take for granted today, occurred during this period as well. So I think there's a lot of facts about this. I'm not a spokesman for all things government does. Maybe Reed's more comfortable than that. But let's also be honest about government deficits and entitlements. I just watched a bipartisan effort with plenty of Democratic senators on board on a farm bill that's got to be one of the most heinous pieces of legislation in terms of entitlements and pork belly spending and subsidies for the rich that I've ever seen, as much or more than any. So I guess you can pick your favorite rich guy, and if it's a farmer who makes $750,000 to $1.2 million, that subsidy's okay. But I guess if you're an oil guy, you're evil. Pork barrel spending and entitlement spending is an enormous part of that deficit story, and I don't think you could identify a United States senator who has a longer and more combative record about pork barrel spending, bar none, in the United States Senate than Senator John McCain.
Chairman Hunt, you referenced the wireless industry a couple of times. What would you see as the key next steps to bring about sort of the Barack Obama vision of how wireless should be regulated in the country?
So John McCain, not I, John McCain has said that John McCain is computer illiterate and doesn't know much about economics. I think this might be his quirky sense of humor more than an admission against interest, but anyone can find economists who will explain the following, because they've explained it to me. When you have vertically integrated industries, and that's the merger sin here, to have allowed the Bells to gobble up long distance. When you have vertically integrated industries and then you allow the vertically integrated companies to gain duopoly or monopoly power over a commodity that lies at the base of their industry, then for sure you will get anti-competitive pricing, super competitive pricing, and reduced innovation. That is the number one bad antitrust policy of the Bush-McCain era. They have allowed the vertically integrated bells, which they encouraged to vertically integrate, to then gain as much access to and ownership of spectrum as could possibly be imagined, particularly in the lower frequencies. Therefore, competitors can't get access to the frequencies appropriate for coverage, can't launch competitive businesses, and therefore we see the prices go up. So these two vertically integrated companies right now charge in the neighborhood of 75 to 80% more per minute than the small rivals who are struggling to compete. And what do we see? We see that they assume in these big companies that they still have an open door under Bush-McCain, so they're trying to consolidate even more. The announcement of the Verizon acquisition was just last week. These are not issues of morality. These are issues of just good common sense and good economics. And what we've seen is that the Bush-McCain choice again and again and again is consolidation, and to go back to something that Mike said at the beginning, to support the fundamental reallocation of income in our country. Corporations are not bad. They are the source of productivity. But corporate profits are at a higher share of total income than in the last 60 years in our country.
Chairman Powell?
Reed makes an interesting point about vertical integration, and I think for those who are familiar with telecom might know this or not, but let's remember that the reason vertical integration occurred in part was because statutory and regulatory rules that said horizontal integration was not possible. I would take the view quite strongly that when the government barred horizontal mergers by virtue of Section 272 in the Great Telecom Act that supposedly was going to hyper-manage competitive forces, it would have been better if it had allowed vertical industries to consolidate in a way that then you would have had 3 or 4 major full communication services companies competing with each other. But we didn't. We told Bells that you couldn't integrate with long-distance companies, so the only acquisitions available to you were all horizontal. And what happened? We horizontally integrated the long-distance industry on one side of the line, and we horizontally integrated the local companies on the other side of the line, both of which did not have the capability to provide the full suite of communication services, and that led to the situation we have today. So I happen to agree that, first of all, as an antitrust lawyer myself, I don't take the view that vertical integration is per se bad. By the way, neither do the antitrust scholars or the courts. But the consequences are also distorted by regulatory actions that often produce results that would not have occurred naturally in the free market.
Connor?
If you're going to have these massive vertically integrated companies, then you need to, and I hesitate to say this, look to our neighbor to the north where 40 megahertz were allocated for startups and new entrepreneurs to buy, because without spectrum, nobody can start a new business and compete.
I'm going to wrap one more question, then we'll open it up to the audience. When it comes time for the next administration to nominate FCC commissioners, what specific skills and qualifications should be in demand, and what sort of regulatory philosophy will each administration be looking for? And we will stipulate that Commissioner Adelstein is the perfect commissioner. But other than that, other than Jonathan Adelstein types, what will people look for in the next administration?
One rule that I think Mike and I can agree on, almost certain of this, is that as a matter of practice, no one who has ever served at the FCC should ever go back. What do I think about the FCC? First of all, it needs to be clear about its goals. It ought to publish goals in a very specific way. The goals do not need to be micromanaging goals, but they need to be clear. You ought to be able to look them up on a website, and then it needs to be held accountable for results. And if the results are not the same as the goals, the FCC ought to have an obligation to explain what the heck happened in its opinion. It ought to measure and report honestly all results, and it needs to be fair to all companies and stay far away from the buddy system that plagues Washington today. In the World Trade Organization Treaty of 1997, where I assisted Charlene Barshevsky in the negotiation, the United States got more than 60 other countries to commit to creating independent regulators. And now we need to reestablish the independence of our own agencies from the business of delivering regulatory pork, from hiding the truth about the economy and the environment and society from American people, and from being unbalanced and unhinged in the application of law to the different companies that appear in front of those agencies.
Well, Reed destroyed our plan, which was to put him back. But he will not serve even if asked, apparently. I think the first thing I would say is to remember, even though we've conflated it here, the Federal Communication Commission under law is an independent regulatory authority. It is not the executive branch of the presidency. The presidency, in fact, is prohibited in many significant ways from directing or over-influencing the activity of the commission. I happen to be one who believes that's correct. I think Weed's echoing the importance of its independence. Its independence is supposed to be part of its strength, and when that begins to blur, particularly informally, I think troubling things can start to happen. Which means that where is the premium placed? The premium place is placed on the quality of the women and men that you send there to serve. And I think that they should always be, and Senator McCain has expressed this view to me, of the highest unflinching integrity, both principled and personal and ethical, because you're entrusting in them a phenomenal amount of power. A phenomenal amount of power over the country's GDP, a phenomenal amount of power over the conditions of the information age. And by the way, when you have a mini organization that all it needs is 3 of 5 people to agree, that's a pretty breathtaking hair trigger on the impact that could happen on the company. So they have to be people who you believe, whether you agree with them or you don't agree with them, that they're operating in what they believe to be their best judgment and their best interest. And that has to be above reproach. I think the second thing is you need to select people who do have some issue substance. This is not a playground. This stuff is hard, it's complex, it's complicated. It involves billions and billions of dollars, very complex high technologies, and I would like to see presidents who make it a priority to think thoroughly and carefully about finding people of talent who have the experience to serve on the commission. I think those things are critical. You also have to be a person committed to the law. I remember when I went through confirmation hearing, a question I got asked repeatedly by both Republican senators and Democratic senators were, if there was a law that you disagreed with, would you do it anyway? I'm going to give you a tip. There's only one answer to the tip. You would think so, though. But I think too often people think there are multiple answers to that question. The FCC is an agency of delegated authority. It is a tenuous constitutional agency in the scheme of government, and it has to ruthlessly and fairly adhere to the Administrative Procedure Act, to the laws that govern its actions. It can't be a free safety for all things that can't be done in Congress. And I think too often, by the way, I would fault not only the industry and the bar, but I'd fault the commission itself when it lets itself become a place to turn to when actions can't be effectively taken elsewhere, when there really isn't any mandate for the commission to touch those things, and they touch them anyway. So I think that would be something he would be focused on.
Okay.
Can I say one
Sure.
thing? I completely agree with Mike about the rule of law. The problem is that there is a lot of evidence that John McCain doesn't. And I specifically refer to the fact that just in the last week, people have told the press that Senator McCain is in favor of the unitary executive theory, particularly as applied to telephone companies and surveillance, and that what that specifically means is that if there is a law passed by Congress, then the White House and presumably the FCC don't have to pay any attention to it. This is not a small issue. If you believe in the rule of law, then you don't want to be voting for Senator McCain to continue the policies of the Bush administration.
Well, I would say Reid has worked really hard to pull me into the FISA debate, but let me tell you, he has just stated as badly, accurately as he could Senator McCain's position. And for all those press who are interested, I'll be happy to give you the quotes of both Doug Holtz-Eakin, his policy advisor on this issue, that have made very, very clear that he believes it's essential to modernize and reform the statutes in Congress. He has supported the efforts. By the way, the one candidate who has not voted in favor of a congressional rule of law to govern this issue is Senator Obama, who sided with House Democrats who have prevented this legislation from coming into being. And so if you care about the health, safety, welfare of the country, and you believe that these issues need to be resolved in a consensus way, then there needs to be an effective statute that modifies and reforms the bill. Senator McCain has said that a president is obligated to follow the statutes that Congress passes, but it also needs to pass one. And he would urge Senator Obama and others to get behind the reform legislation.
So this is news, this part.
It's not new. I mean,
you're saying that John McCain actually doesn't believe in the unitary executive theory and would adhere to congressional restrictions on surveillance, that's news.
It's not news.
Okay, let's follow up with some questions from the audience. We have a microphone, so yes, sir. Why don't you identify yourself and who you're with?
I'm Bill Carnell, and I'm feeling a little bit like the whipping boy here because I'm with Verizon. But I'm not here representing Verizon.
We like you when you invest.
I'm not representing Verizon, just a good member of the Federalist Society. I wonder, either of you, we've been talking a little bit about the relative merits of government making command decisions in an economy versus allowing the market. And a number of examples spring to mind about its previous forays into putting its thumb on the scales of the market and picking winners and losers. And I wonder, just sort of in retrospect, if you could, one that comes to mind is the C-block PCS auction, if in retrospect that was a good thing or a bad thing.
Oh, wait, can I go first?
Oh, sure.
I as you may or may not know, have some experience on this topic. By my calculations, and you're welcome to rebut me if I've got the math wrong, a company called Verizon paid almost $6 billion less for the C block than the market price. If that's what you meant about putting a regulatory thumb on the scales, I agree with you. That was wrong, and I think they should send the $6 billion to the Treasury tomorrow.
I think perhaps what he might have been referring to was the designated entity program.
Well, you did say the C block.
Which window? I thought I heard a different one. All right. PCS is what I thought.
Oh, you see, I'm too scarred by recent experiences. Plus, PCS was a long time ago. Are you referring to my favorite topic, next wave?
Yes.
Well, what can I tell you that could possibly exonerate me from the failure to have gotten my commissioners to vote for the compromise I had crafted as I was walking out the door?
Do you want to talk?
Are we still talking about next week?
Barely. I'm sorry. I helped pull us back.
Let's leave.
God help us.
Perhaps more broadly about designated entities and the notion of new entrants. You talked a little bit about this earlier, about opportunities for new entrants in the wireless space. Is the designated entity program something along the lines of what you would imagine an Obama administration supporting as a way to facilitate new entry?
You know, as far as the spectrum is concerned, as I was saying before, I'd start with just having it be that we didn't let Verizon and AT&T buy all the spectrum. That would be a good start. Currently, the policy is that's okay with the Bush-McCain government.
It's going to be easier.
I think the issue is simple, in the sense that why should anybody disagree with the objective of new entrants? Why should anybody disagree with the objectives of trying to provide spectrum for opportunity? And frankly, I would speak positively of Democratic and Republican commissions. There may be differences in degrees, but I haven't seen a commission or a government who isn't concerned about those things and made some effort to provide an opportunity. What's more disheartening is most of those efforts have in one way or the other collapsed on themselves. And I think that, to be honest, I don't think government has figured out a great way to do this. Reed was a champion of DE early on. Courts intervened. A whole lot of complexities got added to Next Wave. It ultimately fell in on itself. The current FCC just attempted to do some micromanaging of the D block in an effort to pursue an absolutely worthy objective. We can't disagree with that on a bipartisan basis, but it collapsed too. The bottom line is it's very, very difficult to figure out the best way to do those things. But I'm not going to be critical of anyone's commitment to the objective, because I don't know of anyone that I've worked with in this space, Republican or Democratic light, who didn't see the value of making an effort to try to provide those opportunities.
Okay, other questions, Randy?
Thank you, Bryan. This is for Mr. Hundt. You expressed a lot of concern about concentration of control in the mass media, and that's always associated with a concern about the lack of diversity of viewpoints available to the public. But so it's a two-part question. Can you tell me specifically, can you name some issues that you think the American people haven't and aren't being exposed to, whether in your local neighborhood or actually worldwide issues? Name some specific issues that are not available. And then secondly, related to this, can you tell me whether Mr. Obama specifically favors reinstatement of the fairness doctrine or not, as a way of addressing what you think is the lack of diversity lack of diversity of views?
It's always John Dingell who asks about the fairness doctrine, and I successfully avoided answering him, and I think I'll do the same here. But as to, with all due respect, but as to the other issue, it's really, really an important issue. Speaking personally, to me, the most glaring example is documented in the recent Senate report about the way the administration misled the United States people concerning the reasons for going into Iraq. That misleading, which is absolutely documented, that misleading was aided and abetted by the mainstream media in the United States, to my perception. And when you look at the polls, it took a very long time, principally driven by people like Senator Obama standing up and the internet being available, for Americans to begin to realize that they'd been buffaloed and deluded by the Bush-McCain administration. Now, this is not a small point. This is of immense importance to the world and to the American people. Is there a direct and obvious correlation between media concentration and that particular successful effort? I don't know that that can be proved, but there is an absolutely clear basis, just from this major story alone, to argue for network neutrality on the internet, so that there can't be a concert of action between network access providers and the government to censor or discriminate against those who would like to have the truth get free.
There's no risk of censoring our friends over here at the press table, so let's open it up for some more additional questions.
Hi, Ted Hearn with Multi-Channel News. What happens going forward on content? Do we see more burdens on parents to acquire technology to filter and block, or more restrictions on providers on how they bundle and package what they're selling? Thank you.
Do you want to?
Sure. Part of this is just me speaking, because I don't know that I've had this conversation with the senators. I want to be clear about that. We should be awful honest and realistic about the explosion of media. It is coming out of the pores of my children. And I think that if we're going to have a coherent approach to how to give them the tools to control, find trust systems, requires a level of media literacy, a kind of sophistication about what they cope with. The idea that we're going to be able to bottle them up and prevent them from seeing anything and everything that you think they should see and hear. First of all, the Constitution is not going to let you do that. It's why I find incoherent. Well, you could say on broadcast you can't do this, but my children get every single show they've ever wanted on YouTube 10 minutes after it runs. As a parent, I am not going to be able to control the values that I raise my children with by trying to cabin them off from particular sources of media, or worse, have the government try to do it for me. I think it's too porous. The system has become too overwhelming. It's similar why I would take a little bit of issue with Reed on the idea. I'm not necessarily one to defend the media's editorial judgments, but let me tell you, don't pretend there was no shortage of views represented in the information cosmos about the war. You know, the rise of blogging and alternate media and the ability to organize opinion. If anything, I think one would be amazed at the speed with which the counter message eventually took hold, not with the slowness of it. I don't know in any history of any war at any time in which communication tools were different that you would have seen this much political opinion change and truth rooted out in the way that it was in the internet age in breathtaking fashion. Also, you know, there were plenty of mouthpieces about the war. I'm not the person to talk about war, but you know, ask Senator Hillary Clinton about statements about the war. I mean, you know, this country, you know, got where it did for lots of reasons, and I'm glad that all I do is technology and information policy.
One final question. Did you have one?
I was wondering if Reed was going to answer that. That one too, on the content.
Yeah, let me tell you what happened when I first met Barack Obama. He was thinking of running for the U.S. Senate. It was before the invasion in Iraq, and I said, if you already were in the U.S. Senate, how would you vote on the invasion? And he said he would vote against it, and he had me from the word no. But at that time, that was an extremely unpopular position to take. And the reason is that all across our country, the mainstream media, in concert with the Bush-McCain government, had in fact convinced the American people of a great number of assertions about Iraq, which we now see quite painfully and quite tragically were not true. It shouldn't be the case that someone like Barack Obama stands in such a small company of people who somehow see the truth through all of the disinformation. It ought to be that we all can see the truth about these issues. And that's why we stand for network neutrality, and that's why it is critically important to have plenty of multiple sources of mainstream media, and that is why it is immensely important to focus not on censorship, although I agree with Mike, there are many things about the impact of media on children that ought to be fixed and can be fixed if we keep plugging away with technological and even some commercial solutions. But it is much more important to focus as well on absolutely open access to true facts about the issues important to America.
And my question is, I've heard this on this net neutrality debate for years, that antitrust law can fix it. How does antitrust law prevent or punish a network service provider from blocking access of a customer to the internet or something off the internet? How does that work?
Well, it would just depend on the scenario, but take, for example, if a network provider blocked content in order to direct you or favor the offering that it provided as an alternative, that would likely give rise to an antitrust claim. You know, we could go through lots of scenarios.
How do I know that, you know, if I'm the person, if I'm the person in my house on my...
If you don't know, I don't know what the harm. I don't know what there has to be some harm that's actually real, or there isn't any kind of problem, right? But if Comcast would only let you go to Gap's jeans because they had to deal with them and not to Levi's jeans, I think that would give rise to an anti-competitive action. But it's also unfair to suggest let's just deal in sort of really remote hypotheticals about sort of mysterious, you know, bit diversions that nobody can quite tell me what happens that has an anti-consumer effect. And that's the reason that is not a trivial question is I have never heard anyone, including Barack Obama. Bill Kennard and I had this debate at the National Cable Show. He himself said that Obama wouldn't necessarily oppose tiering, wouldn't necessarily oppose some of these, because even the proponents say there is something called reasonable network practices. Right? There's a commissioner right there. I think he would say there is some bevy.
Don't give him any airtime.
No, you're right about that. But let me just finish that point. If there is some activity that we will credit as rational, reasonable network behavior, then you don't need non-discrimination. Because what you're saying is there are certain practices that one might call limiting or blocking or controlling that are reasonable. And by the way, for 100 years, the Telecom Act did not say non-discrimination. 1934 Act says it's unlawful for unreasonable discrimination. And it is in the reasonableness of an action where the rub lies. So these sort of absolutes of sort of everything through, I don't know that people really mean that. And there are bad things that have happened from the everything through model. 70% of the email coming through your system is spam and phishing and viruses as a consequence of an overly open model without sufficient security in the original creation of the email system. The Apple iPhone's visual voicemail feature is a venture between AT&T and Apple to make network changes to make that consumer function available. Is that a violation of network neutrality? I don't know, but these are important questions.
With that, we're going to have to wrap up. Thank you all very much for joining us. I also want to thank Ray Gifford of Camlet Shepherd, who helped organize today's event, but who could not be here. He's out in Denver. And, of course, a round of applause for our two panelists.
Good job for you.